Okay, thank you for that, Andrew, and thank you again, Stephen. Stephen is a busy pastor as well as doing the creation work, so appreciate his time. So it's over to me now, and Andrew, you're going to MC for my session. So I don't think I need to have any introduction, so I'll just go straight in if you don't mind, friends. I'm going to talk to you about the world of feathers, and I'm going to talk to you about this subject because it's close to my heart, as I believe very much in design. I have studied aeronautics, as one or two of you have come as students from the aeronautical side. So you'll enjoy this. Can I just welcome, by the way, others who have joined us, because I know that there are now 54 participants, and that's at least 4 or 5 who've joined us just in the last 20, 25 minutes. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about the wonder of feathers as an example of design. Now, please be aware that this isn't just a creation talk. I'm actually seeking to encourage you that it doesn't matter what you take. You can take quite intricate mechanisms, which is what I'm now going to talk about, but you could take actually something that interests you in nature. And it doesn't have to be a feather, it could be something else in the natural world that you just get fascinated by. And if you just sort of dig a bit and find out the information, you begin to get an awareness that there is an intriguing sophistication involved, which is telling you that this is an example of design. Well, there's a number of books that we have on available. My own book, Genesis for Today, but Stuart Burgess's Hallmarks of Design, and then a book I wrote with him, Wonders of Creation, which you can have a look at. Can I also mention that we have a gentleman, William Arrowsmith, on the sessions today, and he started up brilliantly a series of 3 magazines, one for older folk, one for younger hearts, and one for children. And in one of these, he had a whole article about owls. Well, I'm going to refer to owls today. So go and have a look at that website, and you'll find that some wonderful magazines which young people like William have put together. I'm most impressed that he's basically edited this set of magazines, perhaps not entirely on his own, but he's certainly done an awful lot of it himself. There are other websites that you can use, Christian Values in Education, and a whole series of other websites here, which you can go to. These slides will be available afterwards, so if you have issues about investigating things, you can go to these websites. So feathers. How do feathers work on birds? Well, it's important that you have the right feathers in the right place. I don't know whether you realize this, but even on the wing of a bird, the feathers, as you look down on them, are very different. You've got primary, secondary, and then what we call tertiary feathers closer into the body. And then as you move from the trailing edge forwards, you have covering feathers, primary covering feathers, or they're called covert feathers. Greater covert feathers, medium coverts, lesser coverts. And then as you push really to the front, it's actually getting thicker now with all these feathers. And we have even feathers called allula feathers, which are to do with, really they act like forward flaps on an aircraft. That's in case things are getting a bit low speed and you need to put a flap down. Aeronautics is all to do with flying. How do wings work? Well, it's due to the turning of the flow in order to make a reaction force go upwards. As the flow is turning, it pushes on the wing. And really, that's all it's about. You don't need to talk about, as people sometimes do, very complicated things about the flow traveling faster over the top. Actually, the main issue is that you're turning the flow. You could do it with a bit of paper. I don't know whether you can see me in the screen here. Well, I could just have a bit of paper like that with fast moving air, and it causes a reaction pushing the bit of paper upwards. That's essentially what lift is. And as I mentioned, modern aircraft will have all sorts of devices to make the flow turn. I don't want to get too complicated, but just to say this, that on a bird, obviously you're building the wing with feathers. And so actually it's amazingly the shape of that wing, and the shape actually does become important, but it is relevant to the amount of lift that you get. The shape of that wing is all made by feathers. It's not made by metal, it's not made by wood, it's not made by spars. So you haven't only got the issue of where do you put the feathers is looking down on the wing, but where do you put feathers in terms of back and front? It's really quite remarkable. Just that basic point is really an incredible issue with birds and the way that they are built. And of course, you've got the bone structure, which I haven't time to go into, which is basically an extended fingers and the humerus bone and the radii and the wrist bone, which are making up the wing. And you've got the muscle arrangement. Again, I haven't time to develop that. But just talking about the feathers here, you can see the aerofoil shape of the wing of this white-tailed eagle on the Isle of Mull, which I saw some years ago. They are really dramatic birds, these birds of prey, as they wing their way down to catch, in this case, a fish. So this is aerodynamic excellence in birds. Here's a picture of a red kite, another bird of prey, which has been reintroduced into Wales first and then now has spread right across the British Isles. Red kites and other birds that I'm showing here are using their feathers in order to gain aerodynamic lift. And the position of the feathers is all important. Notice the curving of the wings at the end. So you've got winglets at the end, which are there deliberately to reduce the drag. Other birds don't have them. These are diving birds, gannets in Scotland, and they will actually bring their wings together and become like a dart by the time they've completed their dive and are just about to go into the water. These dramatic pictures were taken by a friend of mine in my church when he was up in Scotland, taking pictures of these gannets coming down like pencils into the water. Absolutely dramatic in the way that they are moving the wing surfaces. Probably the best one at doing this is the Peregrine Falcon, which is shown here in a stoop. That's another word for a dive. Diving at over 200 miles an hour, they have to have special eye covers in order to stop their eyes watering. And there's more could be said about that. Swifts are the fastest flyers in level flight, and they can fly at nearly 70 miles an hour. Then you've got tiny little hummingbirds, which have still got all these different types of feathers. This is the Antilles crested hummingbird, which I saw last year. And you can see the outer feathers that I was talking about, the primary feathers. Even on this tiny little hummingbird, they are split up in exactly the same way. So did birds emerge from reptiles? Did feathers come from scales of a reptile? Well, if you know anything about the scales of a reptile, they're made, yes, of the similar material called keratin. It's not exactly the same keratin, but we'll leave that point just for the time being, because it's not material to my argument. Let's assume that it is the same material. And then people will argue, as they do in this biology book, quite incorrectly, that the feather has the same fundamental structure and development as a reptile scale. But when you look at a rectile scale on the right there, it's nothing like a feather. It actually grows from a different point in the skin or under the skin for a feather. And scales are nothing like feathers. So when he says that they have the same fundamental structure, he hasn't understood what feathers come from, because feathers come from what is called a follicle. And the follicle, as I've already said, grows from just under the skin. And the follicle is actually alive. It's connected to the flesh, and it causes the growth of a keratin structure inside this follicle wall. It's a bit like a tube of plastic in which you've got a feather growing. If I show you a big pen here, and I don't know whether you can see because my picture is very small, but I'm taking a big pen apart and I'm showing you the sheath which is going round this big pen. Well, that's a bit like what a follicle is. The feather is actually inside this follicle and it's growing. So there is a growth collar at the base, and the feather then grows inside this tube, the follicle, and it then spreads out onto the wing of the bird. Now that is absolutely incredible, because there is a reason for it growing in a tube, because if it didn't have a tube around it, then it would interfere with all the other feathers which are also growing. And a bird, of course, molts. It doesn't just grow feathers when it's young, it actually sheds feathers and grows others when it's changing its coat most years. So there is a reason for this. Here is the follicles that you can see made of keratin, little tubes going round the feathers. You can see on this pigeon feather, and you can see the feathers coming out of these tubes as the bird is growing its feathers on this wing. But there is no evolution here, because if you didn't have those tubes, you wouldn't be able to get the structure of a feather going in the right place. So just one feather is sufficient evidence to show us that there isn't an evolution of feathers, because one feather has to be in exactly the right place and is different from all the other primary feathers, if it's a primary, and it's certainly different from the secondaries and tertiary. And you've got to have the tube, the follicle structure, in order to make a feather. It's not just a matter of fraying a scale, because people who say that feathers came from frayed scales haven't understood that there is a device which is alive, which is producing the feather, called the follicle, which I've just described. So how does one feather on its own hang together? Do you know that? What is it that makes the feather hang together? What is it that the barbs of a feather actually are connected one to the other? Well, this only becomes apparent, the answer to this question only becomes apparent when you look at a feather under a microscope. On the left there, I've got a picture of a starling secondary feather, which I just picked up here in Lancashire. Would you believe it? There are lots of birds in Lancashire, as they used to be where I lived in Yorkshire. They do have birds, they do come out now and again. Sometimes it's a bit of a dreary day, as it is today, but you'll see sometimes these wonderful starling feathers. And you'll see actually the sheen on them, which I'll come to in a moment. But I'm talking now about the way the barbs, which are the strands which come out of the central part of the feather, which we call the rachis, but that central stem has, coming out of it, barbs. Well, why is it that the barbs hang together? So you pull on the feather and you'll find that the barbs hang together. If you pull hard enough, you can separate them. Why is it that they hang together? Well, that's because coming out of the barbs are tiny, tiny little mini barbs. We'll call them barbules. And the barbules, which are on my diagram coming out of the left-hand side of the barbs, have hooks on, and the barbules coming out from the right-hand side of the barbs have ridges on. So that means that the hooks from the left-handed barbules slide over the ridges of the right-handed barbules, which means that adjacent barbs are now connected together a bit like Velcro, except that you haven't got hooks on brushed nylon, you've got hooks on ridges, a bit like curtain hangers hanging over curtain rails, and they're sliding on these other ridged barbules. That is how a feather hangs together. So here's an actual picture of those hooked barbules sliding over the ridges, as you can see on this picture. And this was taken by David Menton from Answers in Genesis some years ago. And you can see this mechanism that I'm referring to. Here's another picture of the same mechanism. And supposedly 99 million year old feathers found in amber, which is hardened resin, shows no difference in the basic structure. Indeed, the feather in this amber is not 99 million years old. It's exactly the same as a modern feather. Indeed, Richard Dawkins, when he was pressed on this matter about where did feathers come from, how did they emerge, he says, he talked about a little pimple starting off, its process to become a feather. And then he sort of exclaimed at one point in this interview many years ago, I suppose it's a matter of faith on my part. In other words, it's blind faith. His faith has nothing to do with faith based on evidence. It's faith based on his ideological, tenacious grip on evolution, saying that I don't want to give that up. And he's still going to believe it, even though the evidence points in the other direction. So feathers are the same in hardened resin, which has become amber, as modern feathers. There is no difference. There is no evolution. Well, let me come on to a last part of what I want to speak about today. I could do a whole talk all about other things to do with flight, but I'm just homing in on feathers. Let me ask a question, which would be perhaps particularly relevant to what I was saying earlier about that magazine, which William has produced. He had a whole article there about owls. He was talking about long-eared owls, short-eared owls. He mentioned the barn owl. But these owls have amazing flight. They fly quietly. And it's all to do with the feathers. This is utterly amazing. The secret as to why the barn owl is able to do this is in incredible structures added to their flight feathers. It's to do with the leading edge and the trailing edge of the feathers. There is a comb at the front and a fringe at the back. Let me now show you a bit more about this. At the leading edge of the flight feathers, which is where most of the aerodynamic noise comes from, for the pigeon to begin with, then it was the Peregrine Falcon, which were very powerful, but still made quite a lot of noise. But the owl has this incredible structure. It's like a comb sitting proud of the feather. And then at the trailing edge, there is an arrangement of a fringe which breaks up the air to stop it making big what we call vortices of circling air. And this is an amazing point. Here's the comb at the front of these feathers, right? The leading edge of these flight feathers. And then we see at the edge, as I showed you, a fringe. This is brilliant engineering. Now, to suggest that this evolved is frankly trying to put a mind into evolution, which evolution doesn't have. Everything is telling you that owls always have had this amazingly quiet flight. And indeed, this has brought inspiration for making wind turbines quieter. Wind turbines can be very noisy and cause vibrations. So here's a point which is of practical help to us in our witness to those who think that creation or a creation-based thinking doesn't open up good research. Many people have tried to argue that when you take a creation position, it closes down research because, as was said in the first talk, our opponents say, you're just saying that God did it. But of course, we're not saying that. What we're saying is that, yes, God has made these creatures, but he has actually put in them features which are waiting for us to discover. As Johann Kepler said many centuries ago, I am thinking God's thoughts after him. And this whole area of what we call biomimetics, that is copying nature with a view to using it in engineering, is an illustration, if only people realized it, of this creation principle working out. We are seeing something in nature saying, why does it work like that? Then we uncover why it's working the way it is. And people now have got the idea as to how to make wind turbines quieter by copying owl feathers. So what people have done is on their wind turbines, if you look here, I don't know whether you can see, obviously it's the picture of a barn owl and you can see there is a comb there. But if you look at the right-hand picture, you can see the wind turbine leading edge has got a comb on top, right? That's what I'm referring to. It's that comb which breaks up the air into a much smaller set of little spinning bits of air, which we call vortices, but they're so small that they no longer make the noise that they did previously. That's how an owl works. Then you have a serrated fringe on the trailing edge as well. So you have a comb at the front and then a serrated trailing edge as is shown there. So this is what I'm referring to. You can see in the right-hand picture again, you can see something sitting proud near the leading edge of the aerofoil of the wind turbine. And then you have the serrated trailing edge. That's what's going on. And that has come as a result of looking at owls. So if it's taken minds to do that, doesn't that show you that there is no evolution in the original design, which is there in owls right from the word go? Well, let me close by looking at another feature in feathers. I've been talking to you about the way feathers need to be placed in the right place to produce lift. The feathers are positioned not only looking down on a wing, but looking sideways on a wing, thickening at the front, so that you get a special shape, so that you can actually make sure that the air turns and produces lift in the right way. I showed you pictures of eagles. I showed you pictures of even tiny little hummingbirds. Then I talked about the owl with its specially quiet feathers. But there is something else which is really amazing, and that is that birds have incredible colors. A lot of these colors are produced by pigments, but some of them are produced simply by reflection. And it's true of the peacock, which has this amazing eye structure in its huge tail that it uses to show off to a female bird or female peahen, which is usually not interested at all. So when people try to say this is all to do with, you know, getting the best female, I don't really think that adds up, but you can read articles about that. Actually, I don't think that is the case. I think it's actually put primarily for the glory of God that men should actually give praise to him for. So how does this structure work on a peacock feather? We're no longer talking primarily here about flight feathers. We're talking about feathers which are there to show an image. Now, much of the peacock feather is to do with browns, which comes from a pigment. But the amazing point here is that the eye, the false eye, there's many of them, of course, on a peacock tail, that eye is made of other colors, some of which are produced by a special reflection ability of those barbs. But I want you to see, first of all, that the actual shape, which is in the middle, is a bit like a cardioid, as it's called mathematically. Then you've got a shape which looks more like an egg. One of them looks more like a circle. But with each one of them, you've got yellow, brown, you've got fluorescent green, you've got fluorescent blue. But this is in a growing feather, and the image stays in the same position as the barbs grow through that image. This is just absolutely brilliant in terms of engineering. Because if you look at an individual barb, the one that I'm pointing to on this image, it starts off brown, then it becomes yellow, then it goes brown again, then it goes yellow. If you look at another one, it will actually go through not only the brown, it will go through the fluorescent green and the fluorescent blue, and so on. There's even a purple there as well. And this image is staying the same as the barbs grow through it, which I find staggering. But now we come to the iridescent colors. The blues and the greens here are formed not by pigment. They are produced by twin layers such that both are transparent. And as the light comes in, it gets bent. A bit like when you look at a bathtub or any tub of water, the bottom looks higher than it really is because the light gets bent. Okay, but now the reason you get this strange fluorescent behavior is that the incident ray, some of it gets reflected at the top, but the part of it gets bent and goes down to the bottom of that layer, and it gets reflected at a different angle, and it comes out at a different place. That then leads to the fact that you get colors forming which are due to reflection. We call this iridescence, and it particularly applies to the iridescent greens and blues. And it was what we saw on the sheen of the feather that I showed you earlier from a starling. So all this is while the feather is growing through the eye. This just blows my mind away. Does it blow yours away? I think if you show some of this to your friends and just simply ask them if they're willing to engage, where did this come from? What's this really saying to us? It's not saying evolution, it's saying design. And of course, many people have learned from this to make rather beautiful pictures using iridescence. Darwin, by the way, said this: the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Well, may it have made him sick, because he didn't understand and didn't want to give glory to the God who has made all these things. In the book of Job, it says, have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like him? Deck yourself now with majesty and excellency, and array yourself for thyself with glory and with beauty. Everything is speaking here of the wonder of what God has done. I love this verse in Romans 1, verse 20. The invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. When it comes to the last day, many people who've rejected God will be asked, why didn't you give me glory for the things that I've made? It was obvious I was there. But it's sad when many people who are Christians are promoting evolution and who are leading many people to become atheists because they don't take account of Romans 1:20. A person who believes that God used evolution actually rarely will quote Romans 1:20, because Romans 1:20 is clearly telling us that the invisible things of God are there ready to be exposed. And I've given you some illustration of them in flight. But you might say, well, nature is red in tooth and claw. A kestrel here picking up a poor vole. Well, yes, where did that come from? We have to acknowledge that the world is ugly now. Well, the same book in Romans 8 says, we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. And I agree with the first speaker, Stephen Lloyd, who pointed us to the fact that when you go down that line, it leads us to the gospel as the only answer, whether it be man-made atrocities. Being there at a terrible memorial of the death of hundreds of thousands of Jews in Warsaw during the war. On the right and on the left, of course, it's natural disasters. Everything is telling us that our world is no longer good. And it leads us to think of the cross. Why things aren't good? Well, God knows that they're not good. While we were yet sinners, Christ Jesus came into the world to die for us. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So I believe that when we take the whole message of design carefully, we can actually use it for evangelism. And it's a powerful tool when it's correctly used, and will drive a thinking soul to ask serious questions about the world, about God who made it, and about the gospel and death and suffering being turned around because Jesus bled and died to save us from our sins. Over to question time now. Thank you for that. Thank you for listening, and over to Andrew.